before the world carved his face into stone and placed him beside America's founding icons. Ulysses S. Grant was simply a man trying to hold his family together while leading a nation through its darkest hour. He defeated the Confederacy, preserved the Union, and became the symbol of reunion after a war that nearly destroyed the country. Yet what happened to the generation born after him? The 12 grandchildren who inherited his name, his myth, and the enormous expectations of a nation desperate for heroes. Their lives unfolded not on battlefields or in smoke-filled war rooms, but in the uneasy aftermath of victory, where legacy can become a blessing, a burden, or even a curse. Some rose to prominence, some vanished into quiet obscurity, and others carried secrets, heartbreaks, and reinventions that reshaped the Grant family far beyond their grandfather's shadow. This is the untold story of Ulysses S. Grant's 12 grandchildren, a dynasty born from war, tested by change and defined by the complicated inheritance of one of America's most consequential men. Ulysses S. Grant's public life is one of the most meticulously documented in American history. Civil War general, two-term president, world traveler, memoirist, whose final work remains a landmark of American literature. But his private world, especially the generations that followed him, has always existed in the quieter shadows of national memory. Grant raised 4 children, each shaped by the turbulence of war, the pressures of Reconstruction, and the weight of their father's iconic status. From these 4 children came 12 grandchildren, born into a world their grandfather helped rebuild, yet burdened by a lineage that demanded strength, dignity, and public virtue at every turn. These grandchildren were born into a family standing at the intersection of triumph and tragedy. They inherited not only a famous name, but the consequences of financial collapse, political upheaval, and the changing social landscape of post-Civil War America. Some of them entered military service, trying to honor the legacy of the most celebrated general of the 19th century. Others pursued the arts, the clergy, business, or philanthropy. A few struggled under the immense expectations placed upon them, living lives marked by illness, economic hardship, or quiet anonymity. Their stories reveal a family navigating the shifting sands of American identity. From the Gilded Age to World War I, through the Great Depression and into the new century. To understand how the Grant legacy evolved, we must look beyond the marble monuments and battlefield maps, into the homes, marriages, triumphs, and failures of the 12 grandchildren who bore his name. Their lives form a rich, intertwined narrative, one that reflects the nation's aspirations, its contradictions, and its relentless march forward. The Grant family entered the late 19th century carrying a legacy unmatched in American memory. Ulysses S. Grant had not only commanded the Union armies that broke the Confederacy, he had also served as president during the turbulent years of Reconstruction, fighting to secure civil rights for freed slaves and to hold the fractured nation together. His death in 1885 transformed him from a national figure into a historical monument, a man whose leadership, humility, and sacrifice became central to America's story. But for the Grant family, his passing created something far more personal, the beginning of an inheritance that none of his descendants could escape. Grant's 4 children were shaped by their father's legendary status, but also by his financial downfall. The collapse of the Grant and Ward investment firm in 1884 devastated the family, forcing Grant to complete his memoirs while dying of cancer so they would have financial security. Those memoirs saved the family, but the emotional and economic scars remained, influencing the lives of his children and grandchildren for decades. Frederick Dent Grant, the eldest son, became a military officer and diplomat whose sense of duty echoed his father's discipline. Ulysses S. Grant Jr., known as Buck, pursued law and business, spending his life trying to rebuild the financial stability the family once lost. Jesse Root Grant II, the youngest son, carved out a quieter path in real estate and business ventures, always aware of the family's earlier struggles. Nellie Grant, the general's only daughter, endured a tumultuous marriage that shaped her reputation and the lives of her children. From these 4 distinct lives sprang 12 grandchildren, 12 heirs to a name that carried both pride and pressure. They were born into a nation rapidly transforming. Industrialization surged, urban life expanded, and America's role on the international stage grew more complex. The grandchildren grew up in a world far removed from the farms, camps, and war rooms that shaped their grandfather's identity. Yet they could not escape the influence of his legacy. In schools, military academies, social circles, and professional paths, the Grant name carried expectations that were both an honor and a burden. Some answered those expectations with distinction, serving in the military or public life. Others tried, and sometimes failed, to escape the shadow of a man the world refused to forget. Their stories expose the fragile human reality behind a monumental American legacy. Now, to understand how the legacy shifted from father to children, to the 12 who inherited the Grant name, we turn to the first of them, beginning the journey through a generation shaped by history, but determined to write its own fate. From the powerful but turbulent lives of Grant's 4 children emerged a generation that carried the Union General's legacy into the 20th century. These 12 grandchildren inherited very different circumstances. Frederick's children grew up in military households shaped by discipline and patriotism. Buck's children were raised in a world of business, courts, and financial rebuilding. Nellie's children inherited their mother's emotional scars and the weight of a troubled marriage. And Jesse's children entered a quieter, more entrepreneurial sphere. Some grandchildren embraced the Grant legacy with pride. Others quietly resisted the expectations placed upon them. A few disappeared into obscurity, leaving behind only records of birth, marriage, and death. Yet together, these 12 lives formed the bridge between America's Civil War generation and the modern era. To begin understanding the complexity of this family, we start with the eldest line. The children of Frederick Dent Grant, the firstborn son who inherited not only his father's discipline, but also the responsibility of being the symbolic head of the Grant household after the general's death. The first of his children stands as the beginning of our journey into this historic lineage, Ulysses S. Grant III. Number 12. Ulysses S. Grant III. Ulysses S. Grant III, born in 1881 to Frederick Dent Grant and Ida Honore Grant, entered the world as the first grandson of the Union General, a child born into the long shadow of a man who had saved a nation. His very name carried the weight of expectation. A symbol of continuity in a family whose legacy was already woven into the fabric of American identity. While many descendants of great figures recoil from such pressure, Grant III stepped into it with a quiet determination that would define his entire life. His upbringing mirrored the disciplined world that shaped his father. Frederick, a career officer and diplomat, moved the family through posts in the United States and abroad. These early experiences exposed young Ulysses to the structure, ceremony, and global awareness that came with military life. Unlike other boys of his era, he did not grow up hearing stories of the Civil War. He grew up living inside its aftermath, surrounded by veterans, statesmen, and the persistent memory of a grandfather whose leadership was still revered across the country. It was almost inevitable that Grant III would enter West Point. He was admitted in 1899 and quickly proved himself capable, disciplined, and deeply committed to the values instilled in him. Yet he did not become a replica of his grandfather. He pursued engineering, strategy, and organization, carving out an identity rooted in precision rather than battlefield legend. His career unfolded at a moment when the U.S. Army was modernizing, shifting from Civil War-era tactics toward scientific planning and logistical mastery. Grant III became part of that transformation, serving with distinction in both stateside and international roles. By World War I, he had risen to the rank of major. His service in France exposed him to the brutal realities of modern combat and left him with a profound understanding of warfare, far removed from the cavalry charges and sieges that defined his grandfather's world. After the war, he transitioned into one of the most influential chapters of his life: his role in American urban planning. Grant III became a central figure in the reimagining of Washington, D.C., serving as chairman of the National Capital Park and Planning Commission. In this position, he helped shape the very geography of the nation's capital, blending aesthetics, functionality, and historical preservation. His work preserved the mall, expanded parklands, and ensured that the capital city grew with dignity rather than chaos. In shaping Washington's physical landscape, Grant III extended his grandfather's impact from the battlefield to the built environment, from saving the Union to shaping its capital. Despite his accomplishments, he remained a private man. He married Edith Root, the daughter of Elihu Root, a Nobel Prize-winning statesman, creating a union between two of America's most prominent political families. Their life together was marked by quiet elegance, intellectual fellowship, and mutual respect. Far from the turbulence that plagued other branches of the Grant lineage, Ulysses S. Grant III died in 1968, having lived through the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, and the dawn of the Civil Rights era. His life embodied not the drama of war or the glory of political power, but the enduring strength of legacy carried with humility. He proved that inheriting a great name need not mean living in its shadow, that one can honor the past by building, improving, and envisioning the future. Number 11. Julia Dent Grant, Frederick's daughter. Julia Dent Grant, born in 1882 to Frederick Dent Grant and Ida Honoré Grant, inherited more than the distinguished name of her grandmother, Julia Dent Grant. She inherited the grace, resilience, and quiet fortitude that had defined the matriarch of the Grant family during the Civil War, while her brother, Ulysses S. Grant III, channeled the legacy of battlefield command and national leadership. Julia carried forward the legacy of strength behind the scenes, the kind of influence that operates not through public action, but through character, loyalty, and the subtle shaping of domestic and social worlds. Growing up as the daughter of a prominent military officer and diplomat, Julia's early life was marked by travel, formality, and exposure to international society. From Vienna to New York to the Western frontier, she experienced the shifting landscapes of a nation in transition. Her father's assignments introduced her to political circles, diplomatic gatherings, and military households, giving her a cosmopolitan upbringing rare among American women of her era. Yet despite the sophistication of her environment, Julia remained grounded, shaped by the values of dignity and restraint that had defined the Grant household since the days of Appomattox. In 1907, Julia married Prince Kantakuzene Speransky, a Russian nobleman and military officer connected to one of the empire's oldest aristocratic families. With this marriage, Julia's life took a dramatic and unexpected turn. She became a princess in the Russian Empire, a transformation that astonished American society. Suddenly, the granddaughter of a Union general found herself living in the glittering, precarious world of the Russian aristocracy on the eve of revolution. For several years, she lived in St. Petersburg, attending imperial balls, navigating court politics, and observing firsthand the tensions that would soon engulf the empire. But the glamour was fragile. When the Russian Revolution erupted in 1917, everything Julia had built in her new life collapsed. She and her husband fled Russia with little more than what they could carry, narrowly escaping the violence that shattered the old order. The revolution stripped them of their titles, their estates, and their social status. A second financial catastrophe mirroring the earlier loss suffered by her grandfather in his final years. Back in the United States, Julia confronted a new world where the grandeur of aristocracy meant little. She rebuilt her life through writing, public speaking, and a quiet return to the American identity she had once left behind. Her memoirs, which chronicled the fall of the Russian aristocracy, offered Americans a rare, intimate view into the twilight of imperial Russia. She transformed personal tragedy into historical testimony, capturing the collapse of an era with clarity and emotional depth. Her marriage eventually dissolved under the pressures of displacement and loss, Yet Julia persisted with the steady resilience characteristic of the Grant line. She supported her children, maintained her social connections, and continued to write, her voice becoming an unexpected bridge between two worlds: the American democratic tradition and the vanished aristocratic world of the Romanovs. Julia Dent Grant lived until 1975, outlasting nearly every major political order she had known: the Civil War generation of her childhood, the Romanov dynasty she had married into, the revolutions and world wars of the 20th century, and the Cold War tensions that defined her later years. Her life was a testament to adaptability. A granddaughter of the Union general who became a Russian princess, a witness to political upheaval on two continents, and a survivor who rebuilt identity from ashes more than once. In the saga of Ulysses S. Grant's 12 grandchildren, Julia's story stands as the most dramatic: a life shaped by love, dislocation, revolution, and reinvention, proving that even the descendants of America's greatest general were not immune to the tides of global history. Number 10. Edith Root Grant, Frederick's youngest daughter. Edith Root Grant, born in 1908 to Frederick Dent Grant and Ida Honore Grant, came into the world nearly 3 decades after the Civil War. A granddaughter of Ulysses S. Grant, who would experience a lifetime shaped not by battlefields or political power, but by quiet strength, intellectual refinement, and the profound influence of two of America's most distinguished families. For Edith was not only a Grant by birth, she was connected through marriage and heritage to the Root family, whose patriarch, Elihu Root, was one of the greatest statesmen of the Progressive Era. That intersection of legacies would define her life in ways both subtle and deeply significant. As the youngest of Frederick's children and the only one born after the death of her grandfather, Edith never knew the general personally. Yet his presence shaped her childhood in ways she never had to articulate. She was raised in a household steeped in stories of service, sacrifice, and national duty. Teachings passed down by her father Frederick, who had marched beside his own father on campaign, and by her mother Ida, who preserved the social grace and intellectual curiosity that had defined her own family. Edith grew up in a world of polished dinner tables, diplomatic discourse, and the expectation that a Grant carried responsibility wherever she went. But unlike her older siblings, whose early lives were marked by international travel and the fading glamour of aristocratic connections, Edith's upbringing was steadier, more insulated, and rooted firmly in American society. She attended elite schools, moved in refined social circles, and developed a temperament marked by composure, discretion, and a deep appreciation for the arts. Her education echoed the ambitions of an era in which women from esteemed families were expected to cultivate refinement, intelligence, and quiet leadership, qualities Edith embraced with ease. Her marriage further intertwined the Grant lineage with one of America's most prominent political families. In 1939, she wed Elihu Root III, grandson of the famed lawyer, senator, and Nobel Peace Prize recipient Elihu Root. The union symbolized more than the joining of two old American names. It represented a convergence of public service traditions that spanned from the Civil War through the Progressive Era. Together, Edith and Elihu lived a life guided by intellectual engagement, civic responsibility, and an understated sense of duty. Yet Edith remained a private figure, one whose life unfolded not in the public spotlight, but in the quiet influence of social, philanthropic, and cultural circles. She supported charitable efforts, maintained the historical memory of both the Grant and Root families, and served as an anchor in a lineage increasingly dispersed by marriage, geography, and the shifting social landscapes of the 20th century. Her steadiness stood in stark contrast to the dramatic upheavals experienced by her sister Julia, who had survived the Russian Revolution, or the global responsibilities embraced by her brother Ulysses S. Grant III. Edith's strength lay in preservation of dignity, of tradition, of the subtle continuity that binds generations together through values rather than public achievements. She lived through the Great Depression, World War II, the post-war boom, and the cultural revolutions of the 1960s and 1970s, witnessing a world that transformed far beyond anything her legendary grandfather could have imagined. Through it all, she remained a quiet custodian of family history, the kind of presence whose importance becomes clearer only when viewing the family as a whole. Edith Root Grant passed away in 1975, the same year as her sister Julia, marking the end of Frederick Dent Grant's immediate lineage. Her legacy is one of gentle endurance, a testament to the quieter branches of great families, those whose contributions are measured not in headlines, but in the stability, grace, and continuity they provide through decades of change. Number 9. Ulysses S. Grant IV, Buck Grant's son. Ulysses S. Grant IV, born in 1893 to Ulysses S. Grant Jr., known as Buck, arrived into a family still adjusting to the aftershocks of the financial catastrophe that had nearly ruined his grandfather's final years. Unlike the children of Frederick Dent Grant, who were raised in the disciplined rhythms of military life, Grant IV was shaped by a household steeped in legal study, business ventures, and the lingering scars of loss that had touched the Grant family far earlier than the nation understood. Yet from these circumstances emerged a grandson who would forge a path neither military nor political, but instead grounded in a profound devotion to science. From a young age, Grant IV displayed a temperament marked by curiosity, precision, and a patient fascination with the world around him. He was not drawn to the mythic stories of war that still surrounded the Grant name, nor to the legal battles that consumed portions of his father's career. Instead, he gravitated toward facts, patterns, fossils, and the slow, exacting work of understanding the Earth's ancient past. His intellectual inclinations set him on a course that would ultimately separate him from the grand narratives of his family's history, a departure that defined his legacy. After attending the University of California, Berkeley, Grant IV pursued a doctorate in paleontology, specializing in the intricate field of molluscan fossils. His academic work was rigorous, methodical, and deeply respected. In an era when many descendants of famous figures attempted to leverage their names for influence, Grant IV did the opposite. He carved out a professional identity entirely independent of his lineage, building credibility through research, teaching, and scholarship. His colleagues valued him not as the grandson of a Civil War general, but as a meticulous scientist whose contributions enriched the growing field of paleobiology. He joined the faculty of the University of Southern California, where he became a central figure in the study of invertebrate paleontology. His publications, many written alongside renowned collaborators, enhanced the geological understanding of the Pacific region and helped establish California as a major center for paleontological research. His work required patience and precision, qualities that echoed a quiet discipline reminiscent of his grandfather, though expressed through science rather than strategy. Yet, academia did not shield him from the complexities of family legacy. He was frequently introduced publicly as the grandson of Ulysses S. Grant, a title he accepted with grace but never relied upon. Privately reserved, he preferred the company of colleagues and students to public ceremonies or political gatherings. His life reflected a deliberate choice to honor his family's past without being consumed by it. Grant IV's personal life was marked by stability. He married Ellen Renshaw Dent, whose family ties reached back to the Dent household of St. Louis, a lineage that connected her to the same extended network that once surrounded Julia Dent Grant, the general's wife. Their marriage symbolized not a return to the past, but a continuation of the familial thread that wove together the Grants and Dents across generations. He lived through 2 world wars, the evolution of American science and the cultural revolutions of the mid-20th century, mentoring countless students while quietly shaping the scientific community on the West Coast. When he died in 1977, he left behind not just a legacy of research, but a powerful example of how a descendant of greatness can build a life defined not by inheritance, but by intellectual integrity. In the larger story of Ulysses S. Grant's 12 grandchildren, Ulysses S. Grant IV stands as the emblem of reinvention, the grandson who replaced the battlefield with the laboratory, the sword with the fossil brush, the myths of war with the truths of deep time. He represented a new kind of legacy, one built on inquiry, patience, and the lifelong pursuit of knowledge. Number 8. Chapin Grant, Buck Grant's son. Chapin Grant, born in 1896 to Ulysses S. Buck Grant Jr. and his wife, Fanny Josephine Sheffey, entered the world as the middle child of Buck's family, a position that often leaves a person balancing the expectations of a distinguished name with the shifting dynamics of siblings and circumstance. Unlike his elder brother, who would become a respected scientist, or his younger brother Louis, whose brief life carried its own quiet sorrow. Chapin's path followed the contours of the early 20th century American elite. Education, service, social standing, and the pursuit of stability in a nation undergoing rapid transformation. Chapin grew up in a household still striving to rebuild financial confidence after the Grant family collapse of the 1880s. Buck, determined to restore honor and economic footing to the family name, lived with an intensity that shaped his children's upbringing. Chapin absorbed this drive, but expressed it not through academia like his older brother, nor through military distinction like the descendants of Frederick, but through the pursuit of business, public engagement, and personal reinvention. As a young man, Chapin attended prestigious schools and moved comfortably within the social circles of the American upper class. Yet beneath the polished veneer of his education lay the unspoken weight of expectations placed on every Grant descendant. Being the grandson of a Civil War hero and two-term president carried an invisible pressure, not to achieve greatness in the same way, but to embody dignity, discipline, and respectability. Chapin felt these expectations as both a privilege and a constraint. When World War I erupted, Chapin responded in the manner expected of a Grant. He served. Like many men of his generation, he entered the war with a sense of duty rather than ambition. The conflict exposed him to the realities of modern combat, leaving him with a deeper understanding of sacrifice, a theme etched into the Grant family legacy long before he was born. Unlike his grandfather, Chapin did not command armies or shape national strategy, but he fulfilled his role with quiet steadiness. After the war, Chapin returned to civilian life and entered the world of business. His pursuits reflected the growing opportunities of the post-war boom: real estate, investments, and professional enterprises that sought to stabilize and expand the family's fortunes. He did not chase notoriety, nor did he rely on his grandfather's name for advancement. Instead, he worked with the determination of a man trying to carve out a life defined by competence rather than lineage. Chapin married and raised a family, contributing to the continuation of the Grant lineage through the quieter rhythms of domestic life. Yet, like several of Grant's grandchildren, he also carried the subtle burden of being a link between eras. Born less than 2 decades after Appomattox, but living into the age of roaring automobiles, electrified cities, and social revolutions, his life spanned the transition from the Victorian world of his grandparents to the modern America his children inherited. Though Chapin did not achieve national fame or scientific distinction, his legacy rests in the quiet continuity he provided. He preserved the dignity of the Grant name through reliability, responsibility, and an unwavering sense of personal decorum. He stands in the family narrative as one of the stabilizers, a figure whose contributions were measured not in headlines, but in the steady fulfillment of expectations. Chapin Grant died in 1968, the same year as his cousin Ulysses S. Grant III, marking the symbolic end of an era for the grandchildren of President Grant. His life reminds us that not all legacies are forged through dramatic achievements. Some are built through steadiness, through the quiet carrying of a name that the world remembers even when the individual does not seek its spotlight. Number 7. Louis Grant, Buck Grant's youngest son. Louis Grant, the youngest son of Ulysses S. Buck Grant Jr. and Fanny Josephine Chaffee, was born into a family still striving to rebuild itself after the financial ruin that had devastated the Grants in the 1880s. Unlike his elder brothers, who lived long enough to carve their own professional paths, Louis's life unfolded in a much shorter arc, a brief, fragile story that left behind only faint traces in historical records, but carried profound emotional weight within the family. Born in 1902, Louis entered the world at a moment when the Grant household was striving for renewal. Buck, whose own father had died under the pressure of financial collapse, worked relentlessly to restore the family's stability and dignity. In this environment, each child represented both hope and responsibility, and Louis, as the youngest, was cherished with particular tenderness. Yet the era in which he was born was one where childhood illness remained a constant threat, and not even the descendants of presidents were immune to its dangers. Louis's early years were marked by recurring health struggles. While the details of his illnesses remained sparse, as was common in private family records of the period. What is known is that his life was overshadowed by frailty from a young age. Unlike his brothers, who attended universities and began building adult lives, Louis never had the opportunity to step into a defining role within the Grant legacy. His story became one of potential halted before it could unfold. He died in 1918, at just 16 years old, his passing coinciding with one of the most devastating events in modern history, the global influenza pandemic that claimed millions of lives. Though it is not definitively known whether he succumbed to the pandemic or another illness, the timing places his death within a year of immense loss across the United States. His passing brought deep grief to a family that had already endured the emotional aftershocks of war, public scrutiny, and financial hardship. Louis's short life represents the fragile thread running through even the most storied American families. His absence shaped the emotional landscape of the Grant lineage just as meaningfully as the achievements of his siblings. His parents, who had carried the burden of family restoration for decades, now carried a private sorrow the public would never see. His brothers, Ulysses S and Chapin, moved forward into adulthood with the quiet memory of a younger sibling whose life had ended before it could begin. In the broader narrative of Ulysses S. Grant's 12 grandchildren, Louis stands as a reminder of the humanity behind the headlines, battles, and monuments. His story is not defined by military rank, scientific contribution, or public service, but by the vulnerability that touches every family, even those descended from national icons. His brief life underscores the reality that legacy is not only built through accomplishments, but through the lives that were loved, lost, and remembered within the walls of a family home. Louis Grant's chapter ends quickly, but its emotional resonance stretches into the generations that followed. Number 6. Nellie Grant Jones, Nellie Grant's eldest daughter. Nellie Grant Jones, born in 1876 to Ulysses S. Grant's only daughter, Ellen Nellie Grant, entered the world not long after Appomattox, a moment when her grandfather stood at the height of national reverence. Yet her life would unfold in a manner far different from the triumph her name evoked. She was named for her mother, whose marriage to Englishman Algernon Sartoris had been celebrated with the splendor of a White House wedding, only to deteriorate into emotional turmoil and eventual separation. Into this fractured environment came young Nellie, carrying both the grace of her grandmother and the hidden sorrow of a household struggling beneath its polished surface. From an early age, Nellie Grant Jones lived between two worlds. On one side was the grandeur of her mother's birth family, the Grants of American history, a dynasty of patriotism, leadership, and sacrifice. On the other was the instability that marked her parents' marriage, which grew increasingly strained as Algernon Sartoris succumbed to alcohol, inconsistency, and self-inflicted ruin. The tensions that plagued the household shaped Nellie's earliest memories, and the collapse of the marriage in 1889 left a deep imprint on her emotional landscape. After her parents' separation, Nellie returned to the United States with her mother and siblings, leaving behind the remnants of the transatlantic life her father had once promised. The return to America offered stability, but not ease. The Grant home, still shadowed by the emotional scars of Grant's financial ruin and later his death, was a place where mourning, rebuilding, and resilience intertwined. It was within this atmosphere that young Nellie matured, absorbing the quiet strength of the women around her. Her mother, her grandmother Julia Dent Grant, and the extended family who helped re-establish their footing. As she grew older, Nellie sought a life that balanced independence with tradition. She married Frank H. Jones, an American businessman whose stability contrasted with the turbulence of her father's life. Their marriage provided the grounding Nellie had long sought, allowing her to cultivate her identity away from the drama that had marked her childhood. She raised children, maintained a respectable household, and engaged in the social circles appropriate to a woman of her lineage and upbringing. Yet Nellie's life was not defined solely by domesticity. Like many women of her era, she found purpose in community involvement, charitable engagement, and the preservation of family memory. She carried herself with the quiet dignity that had characterized her grandmother, and was often described as gentle yet resilient. A woman shaped by hardship, but not consumed by it. Nellie lived long enough to witness the immense changes of the early 20th century. The rise of the automobile, the upheaval of World War I, the shifting social expectations placed upon women, and the transformation of America from a post-war nation into a modern industrial power. Through it all, she remained a steady presence in the Grant lineage, a reminder of the complexities that lay behind the public image of America's most famous general. Her life ended in 1954, closing a chapter that had bridged the Victorian world of her grandfather's era and the rapidly evolving landscape of mid-century America. She did not seek fame, nor did she attempt to shape national memory of the Grant family. Instead, her legacy rests in the quiet strength she embodied and in the generations she nurtured, a testament to how the descendants of great figures often carry forward history not on battlefields or in political arenas, but in the lived experiences of ordinary, deeply human lives. Number 5. Vivian Sartoris, Nellie Grant's second daughter. Vivian Sartoris, born in 1879 to Nellie Grant and Algernon Sartoris, entered a world defined by elegance, expectation, and an unspoken tension that ran beneath the surface of her family's public image. She was the second daughter of Ulysses S. Grant's only daughter, a child born into privilege, yet marked from the beginning by the fragility of her parents' troubled marriage. The same White House celebration that had once heralded her mother's union with an English aristocrat now seemed a fading memory by the time Vivian reached girlhood. Her early life unfolded in a home increasingly strained by instability, disappointment, and the vast difference between the life her mother had imagined and the reality she endured. Vivian grew up watching her mother struggle to maintain dignity amid the unraveling of her marriage. Algernon Sartoris, once the dashing English gentleman welcomed into the Grant family, fell into patterns of alcoholism and unreliability. Vivian, like her siblings, absorbed the emotional residue of a household teetering between two continents and two cultures. While her mother clung to the grounding presence of her American family, her father's erratic behavior created an environment of unpredictability that shaped Vivian's earliest understanding of relationships and responsibility. When Nellie finally separated from Algernon in 1889, a bold move for a woman of her era, Vivian was swept into a new chapter of her life. She returned with her mother and siblings to the United States, where they took refuge in the stability of the extended Grant family. This return was not merely a change in geography, but a reclamation of identity. Vivian came of age within the orbit of the Grant legacy, absorbing the values of strength, resilience, and quiet perseverance that had defined her grandmother, Julia Dent Grant, and her aunts and uncles. As she matured, Vivian embraced these values and fashioned a life defined by composure, loyalty, and domestic grace. She married George Varick Heed, a man whose steadiness provided the stability her childhood had lacked. Their life together reflected a commitment to order and quiet companionship. Far removed from the turbulence of her parents' union, Vivian became a devoted wife and mother, fostering an atmosphere of calm that stood in contrast to the emotional unpredictability she had known as a girl. Yet Vivian was not merely a figure of domestic comfort. Like many women of her generation, she found purpose in community engagement and social responsibility. She participated in local charitable efforts, maintained strong ties with the extended Grant family, and protected the memory of her grandfather, whose legacy remained a source of pride and anchor for her identity. In her presence, one could see echoes of Julia Dent Grant's grace, a kind of cultivated gentleness forged from resilience rather than privilege. Vivian lived through eras of tremendous transformation. She experienced the turn of the century, the shocks of World War I and II, the shifting roles of women in American society, and the gradual modernization of the United States. Through each chapter, she remained steadfast, embodying the steady dignity the Grant family name came to symbolize long after her grandfather's death. She died in 1963, closing a life lived far from the battlefield triumphs and political upheavals that defined her grandfather's world. Vivian left no memoirs and made no public declarations, yet her life stands as evidence of how legacy evolves, not only through the high-profile achievements of generals and presidents, but through the quiet strength of their descendants who rebuild, restore, and redefine family identity across changing generations. Number 4. Algernon Grant Sartoris, Nellie Grant's only son. Algernon Grant Sartoris, born in 1882, entered the world carrying the name of two powerful legacies: the aristocratic English lineage of his father, Algernon Charles Frederick Sartoris, and the commanding American legacy of his mother, Nellie Grant, daughter of Ulysses S. Grant. That dual inheritance, one rooted in Old World tradition, the other forged in the fires of the Civil War, would shape the direction of his life in ways both promising and profoundly difficult. As the only son in a family marked by emotional turbulence, Algernon grew up navigating tensions far beyond his control. His father's charm, once celebrated at the White House wedding that united the Sartoris and Grant families, had long since deteriorated into alcoholism, financial instability, and inconsistent parenting. His mother, Nellie, struggled under the weight of a marriage that had become a public disappointment. For young Algernon, childhood became a study in contrasts. Moments of cultural refinement and social expectation overshadowed by the unpredictable behavior of a father who could not sustain the life he had promised. When the marriage finally collapsed in 1889, Algernon was only 7 years old. His mother brought him and his siblings back to the United States, leaving behind the remnants of their English life and returning to the protective embrace of the Grant family. But even the stability of the Grants could not completely erase the emotional fissures created in Algernon's early years. He grew into adolescence, carrying both pride and pressure. Pride in his maternal heritage, and pressure as the male heir of a line shadowed by public scandal. As he reached adulthood, Algernon attempted to build a life that broke from the instability of his father and honored the discipline of the Grant tradition. He enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps, embracing the structure and duty that had defined his grandfather's life. Military service offered purpose and identity, things Algernon had long sought. Yet fate intervened. Like many young men of his era, he was vulnerable not only to the dangers of service, but also to illness, which frequently cut lives short in the decades before modern medicine. Algernon died in 1918 at the age of 36, during the same devastating year that claimed millions through the influenza pandemic. Whether illness or circumstances connected to his service claimed him, his death marked another tragic loss within a family that had already weathered more than its share of sorrow. His early death left behind a sense of what might have been. Algernon had carried within him the potential to restore stability and honor to a lineage marked by his father's failures. He possessed intelligence, sensitivity, and a desire to uphold the values of the Grant family name. But the emotional wounds of his childhood, combined with the brutal realities of his era, prevented him from fully realizing the life he sought. In the broader tapestry of Ulysses S. Grant's 12 grandchildren, Algernon's story is one of quiet tragedy. A man born at the crossroads of two worlds, who spent his life trying to reconcile legacies that pulled him in opposite directions. His journey reminds us that, even in families of great stature, children can inherit burdens as heavy as their names, and that not all legacies are built through public triumph. Some are shaped through struggle, resilience, and the hope for redemption that time never fully grants. Number 3. Rosemary Sartoris, Nellie Grant's youngest child. Rosemary Sartoris, born in 1884 as the youngest child of Nellie Grant and Algernon Sartoris, entered a family already fractured by disappointment, emotional strain, and the disintegration of a marriage that had once been hailed as a symbol of transatlantic unity. She came into the world at the very moment her mother's hopes for a stable life were unraveling. The grandeur of Nellie's White House wedding, the aristocratic promise of her English husband, the glittering expectations placed upon her, all had faded by the time Rosemary reached her earliest memories. What remained was a household struggling under the weight of unmet dreams and a mother fighting to reclaim dignity amidst heartbreak. As the youngest child, Rosemary absorbed the tensions around her in ways her older siblings had not. She grew up witnessing her mother's courage as Nellie finally separated from her troubled husband and returned to the United States with her children. By the time Rosemary was 5 years old, she had crossed the Atlantic not as a visitor, but as a child fleeing instability. The Grant family embraced her, offering the steadiness and emotional warmth that her early years had lacked. The household she entered was grounded in the moral strength of her grandparents and the loyalty of extended relatives who understood both public scrutiny and private sorrow. Rosemary blossomed in this environment, developing a gentle temperament yet a quiet resilience that echoed her mother's determination. She grew into adolescence during a period of profound change in American society. The rise of industrial cities, the emerging independence of American women, and the ongoing transformation of a nation still healing from its Civil War shadows. But unlike the dramatic arcs that shaped the lives of her older siblings, Nellie's namesake daughter, Vivian's navigation of emotional recovery, or Algernon's struggles with identity and duty, Rosemary's life moved with a quieter rhythm. She embraced education, social refinement, and the understated responsibilities expected of a woman of her standing. Her path was not marked by rebellion or scandal, but by the calm pursuit of stability. Eventually, she married Edward Thomas Hoxie, a union that offered the sense of rootedness she had long sought. Their life together was defined not by public attention, but by the intimate routines of domestic life: marriage, motherhood, community presence, and the quiet dignity of private happiness. Yet Rosemary's story also carries the emotional weight of being the child who grew up closest to her mother's trauma. She inherited not the scars themselves, but the sensitivity required to navigate life with awareness of how fragile happiness can be. She remained close to Nellie throughout her life, absorbing her mother's experiences as lessons rather than burdens. Through this bond, Rosemary acquired a depth of perspective that marked her adult years with compassion and steadiness. She lived through both world wars, witnessed the rise of modern America, and saw her family's legacy shift from living memory to national history. As the decades passed, she became one of the last living links to the Grant family's post-war generation. Her siblings passed before her, leaving Rosemary as the quiet custodian of memories that reached back to a time when her grandfather walked the halls of the White House, and her mother was a young bride of extraordinary promise. Rosemary Sartoris Hoxie died in 1968, the same year as her cousin Ulysses S. Grant III, marking a symbolic closing of the generation born from the children of America's great Civil War general. She left behind no memoirs, no sweeping public statements, and no dramatic imprint on national affairs. Yet her life matters profoundly to the story of the Grant family. She represents the healing branch, the child who turned sorrow into stability, who grew from chaos into calm, who chose love and quiet purpose over the turbulence that had shaped the world into which she was born. In the tapestry of Ulysses S. Grant's 12 grandchildren, Rosemary's thread is the tender, steady one, subtle but essential, binding together a family shaped by triumph, tragedy, and transformation. Number 2. Crawford Grant, Jesse Grant's son. Crawford Grant, born in 1889 to Jesse Root Grant II and Lillian Burns Wilkins, entered the world as part of the youngest branch of the Grant dynasty, a branch far removed from the public pressures that shaped Frederick's children or the emotional turbulence that marked Nellie's. Jesse, the youngest son of Ulysses S. Grant, had chosen a quieter and more entrepreneurial path than his brothers, building a life in California focused on real estate, business ventures, and personal independence. Into this environment, Crawford was born, not into military tradition or political expectation, but into a world defined by opportunity, reinvention, and the promise of the American West. Growing up in California at the turn of the 20th century, Crawford experienced a completely different atmosphere from his cousins in Washington, New York, or Illinois. The Grant name still carried immense national prestige, but the physical distance from the East Coast's political circles gave Jesse's children space to build identities outside their grandfather's shadow. Crawford grew up surrounded by the optimism of a region booming with railroads, agriculture, and emerging industries. His childhood was marked less by legacy and more by possibility. Yet even in this freer environment, Crawford felt the undertone of the Grant expectations. He was the eldest son of Jesse, who bore the weight of being the last surviving male child of the great general. Jesse was determined that his children would grow up with the values of discipline, integrity, and ambition, qualities his father had embodied even amid personal hardship. Crawford absorbed these lessons, but expressed them not through public life or military service, but through practical, grounded pursuits. As a young man, Crawford pursued business opportunities across California, mirroring his father's entrepreneurial instincts. He worked in real estate development and financial ventures that sought to capitalize on the rapid growth of cities like Los Angeles and San Diego. He was not a national figure, nor did he seek fame. Instead, he worked steadily, building a life defined by reliability and personal direction rather than public renown. Crawford married Florence O'Keefe, forming a household that valued stability, modesty, and family cohesion. Unlike the dramatic marriages and separations that had shaped earlier Grant generations, Crawford's union reflected the quieter emotional landscape of Jesse's line, a branch of the family that valued privacy and practical living over prestige. He lived through defining chapters of American history: the First World War, the Great Depression, and World War II. Yet throughout these upheavals, Crawford remained a figure of consistency, someone whose life unfolded largely outside the national spotlight. He did not publish memoirs, hold office, or serve in the military at a level that reached historical record. Instead, he represents the kind of descendant often overlooked in dynastic histories: the stabilizer, the bridge between turbulent generations, the custodian of family identity through everyday endurance. Crawford Grant passed away in 1950, having lived a life that quietly preserved the Grant name without magnifying it. His story stands in contrast to the epic trajectories of some of his cousins, reminding us that the legacy of a great family is not only carried by the heirs who join the military, survive revolutions, or shape national policy, but also by those who maintain the steady rhythm of ordinary life. In the lineage of Ulysses S. Grant's grandchildren, Crawford embodies the quieter strength of the Grant tradition, a man who honored his heritage not through prominence, but through integrity, perseverance, and the creation of a stable foundation for the generations that followed. Number 1. Edson Grant, Jesse Grant's second son, the last of Ulysses S. Grant's grandchildren. Edson Grant, born in 1893 to Jesse Root Grant II and his wife Lillian Burns Wilkins, was the final grandchild of Ulysses S. Grant, the 12th and last link in the generation that bridged the world of the Civil War with the rapidly modernizing United States of the 20th century. While earlier branches of the family had produced soldiers, diplomats, scientists, and even a Russian princess, Edson belonged to a quieter lineage, one shaped not by public conflict or aristocratic upheaval, but by the steady rhythms and opportunities of the American West. Growing up in California, Edson was raised in a household that carried the Grant name, but not the weight of Washington politics or military expectation. His father, Jesse, had deliberately stepped away from the legacy of his own father's battlefield glory and his brother's public-facing careers, choosing instead to build a life grounded in land, business, and self-direction. This environment created a very different upbringing for Edson, one where the Grant name evoked pride but did not dictate destiny. As a boy, Edson experienced a world characterized by expansion and optimism. California's growing cities, its open spaces, and its emerging industries provided a backdrop far removed from the rigid expectations of East Coast society. He attended local schools, participated in community life, and observed firsthand the entrepreneurial energy that defined his father's career. Where other Grant grandchildren were raised under the gaze of European courts or the disciplined regimens of military academies, Edson grew up with sunlight, open landscapes, and the freedom to explore. In adolescence and early adulthood, Edson pursued practical work that reflected both his temperament and the opportunities around him. He followed his father into real estate and land management, becoming part of the vast infrastructure that supported California's transformation from rural frontier to booming urban hub. He was not a man who sought titles, nor did he pursue public visibility. Instead, he forged a path rooted in competence, responsibility, and the grounded confidence that his father had modeled throughout his life. Edson also demonstrated a quiet sense of duty, though not in the traditional military sense that had defined the Grant family's first generation. As a young adult during World War I, he registered for service, prepared to answer the call if needed. While records do not indicate combat service, his willingness mirrored the Grant instinct toward national responsibility, expressed in a quieter but equally sincere form. He married Frances Dean, beginning a family life that reflected the values of stability and modesty his parents had prioritized. Their marriage, unmarked by scandal or spectacle, stood in contrast to the tumultuous unions seen in other branches of the family. Edson's life unfolded through decades of continuity rather than disruption, through steady work, faithful partnership, and a commitment to raising the next generation of Grant descendants in an atmosphere of normalcy. As the decades progressed, Edson witnessed a century changing with unprecedented speed. He lived through the Jazz Age, the Great Depression, World War II, and the dawn of the Cold War. He watched as his grandfather's image shifted from living memory to historical icon, etched into textbooks, monuments, and the nation's consciousness. By the time Edson reached his later years, he was one of the last living threads connecting the modern world to the personal legacy of the Union general who had once shaped the fate of the nation. Edson Grant died in 1958, closing the final chapter in the generation of grandchildren who carried the Grant name directly from the figure who preserved the Union. His legacy, quiet but steady, represents the enduring truth that dynasties are not sustained solely by the famous, the powerful, or the extraordinary. They are sustained equally by those who live decent, thoughtful, grounded lives. The individuals who ensure that a great name remains associated not only with public triumph, but with private integrity. With Edson's passing, the line of Ulysses S. Grant's grandchildren reached its natural conclusion, leaving behind a tapestry of lives that collectively tell a far richer story than history books alone ever reveal. Among Ulysses S. Grant's 12 grandchildren, each carried a fragment of the great general's legacy into a new century, shaped by forces their grandfather could never have imagined. Some bore the discipline of military tradition, others the refinement of diplomacy or the quiet steadiness of domestic life. Yet when history examines this generation through the long lens of time, one figure rises above the rest, not for battlefield valor, political authority, or dramatic upheaval, but for the profound way he transformed Grant's legacy into something enduring, visible, and foundational to the modern United States. That grandchild is Ulysses S. Grant III. He did not become a commanding general. He did not lead armies into battle, nor did he attempt to mirror the brilliant decisiveness of the grandfather whose name he shared. Instead, Grant III became the architect of the nation's capital, shaping Washington, D.C. into the monumental city Americans recognize today. Where his grandfather preserved the Union through strategy and courage, Grant III preserved its identity through design, structure, and vision. His influence unfolded quietly, but its consequences were monumental. As chairman of the National Capital Park and Planning Commission, He became a guardian of the L'Enfant and Macmillan plans, the philosophical blueprints that defined Washington as a city of sweeping vistas, classical architecture, and democratic symbolism. He fought against encroaching commercial chaos and political interference, insisting that the capital remain a reflection of national ideals rather than urban disorder. Because of his leadership, the National Mall retained the open, dignified expanse that hosts memorials, protests, inaugurations, and national ceremonies. Through his work, the city became legible, the monuments gained context, the capital gained its soul. In shaping Washington, D.C., Grant III extended his grandfather's legacy from the battlefield to the built environment. One saved the nation, the other shaped the space where the nation remembers. Yet, his significance extends far beyond urban planning. Grant III embodied a rare synthesis of humility and purpose. He neither exploited his lineage nor retreated from it. Instead, he took the Grant legacy and translated it into service suited for a new century. A century in which national identity would be expressed not only through war and politics, but through architecture, public space, and collective memory. His life also served as a stabilizing force within the Grant family itself. While other branches grappled with loss, fractured marriages, and emotional upheaval, Grant III maintained quiet dignity, a disciplined career, and a marriage that united two distinguished American families. He brought the Grant name into circles of intellectualism, civic responsibility, and public planning, arenas that shaped the nation just as profoundly as political office. In the broad narrative of history, some descendants of great figures attempt to imitate the achievements of their ancestors. Others flee from them. Grant III did neither. He carried the weight of his name responsibly, transformed it with originality, and enlarged it through acts of national significance that still shape American life today. He stands as the most significant of Grant's grandchildren, not because he echoed the past, but because he built the future. Through him, the Grant legacy crosses from the 19th century into the modern age, from war to architecture, from victory to vision. A reminder that greatness can evolve, transform, and re-emerge in forms entirely new. The story of Ulysses S. Grant's 12 grandchildren is, at its heart, a story about inheritance, not of wealth or political power, but of a legacy forged in fire, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of unity. They were born into a world transformed by their grandfather's courage, yet each carried that legacy into corners of life he could never have imagined. Their paths diverged across continents, across social classes, across eras of profound national change. And in that divergence lies the most human truth about families shaped by monumental figures. Legacy is not a single story passed down intact, but a living tapestry rewritten by every generation. Frederick's line carried forward discipline, public service, and the quiet dignity of military tradition. His children, from the Russian princess who fled revolution to the engineer who shaped the nation's capital, became witnesses to global upheaval and architects of stability. Their lives bridged the old world and the new, revealing a family capable of evolution even under the weight of history. Buck's children inherited a different burden: the echoes of financial ruin and the pressure to rebuild what had been lost. Their legacies were marked by scholarship, steady work, and lives built on perseverance rather than acclaim. Among them, Ulysses S. Grant IV showed that intellectual pursuit could honor the Grant name just as powerfully as military service, offering the world discoveries measured not in battles won, but in eras of earth revealed. Nellie's children carried the emotional scars of a broken marriage that once dazzled the world. They learned resilience early, navigating instability and heartbreak before finding stability in adulthood. Their stories remind us that legacy does not always confer protection. Sometimes it magnifies vulnerability. Yet their eventual strength, Vivian's poise, Nellie's steadiness, Rosemary's gentleness, testifies to the healing power within generations. And Jesse's children, Crawford and Edson, lived in the wide-open optimism of the American West. where reinvention was possible, and the Grant name meant pride rather than pressure. They became the quiet stewards of the family line, ensuring that dignity continued even in the absence of public attention. Together, these 12 lives form a portrait of a family transformed by history, yet firmly rooted in humanity. Their stories lack the dramatic climax of battlefields or the sweeping arc of presidential politics. But they reveal something deeper: the intimate ways great legacies reshape ordinary lives, how triumph and tragedy echo across generations, and how descendants choose, consciously or quietly, to carry forward the values they inherit. Through them, we see Ulysses S. Grant not only as a general and a president, but as a patriarch whose greatest legacy was not written in orders or victories, but in the lives of those who followed him. They carried his discipline, his humility, his perseverance, his steadiness, sometimes as a burden, often as a guide, always as an anchor. In the end, the grandchildren of Ulysses S. Grant remind us that the measure of a legacy is not found solely in the great deeds of one lifetime, but in the countless smaller lifetimes that continue its story. Their lives, woven through triumph and loss, fame and obscurity, passion and quiet purpose, form the final chapter of the generation that connected the world of the Civil War to the world we know today. And through them, the spirit of Grant, the soldier, the leader, the father, endures.